preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
In the previous lecture, I spoke of the fact that the problem which has been discussed in philosophy, psychology, religion, for several thousand years of the Western world, whether man is good or evil, necessarily corrupted or not, that this problem can be dealt with more usefully, not on the level of generalities, but by the study of the various kinds of aggressiveness and hostility which we find. I suggested then to differentiate between various kinds of hostility, which in their quality are quite different from each other, although I did not mean to say by this that they do not overlap and that the same different qualities are not to be found in the same person. I spoke first of what I called playful aggression, that is to say, where people enjoy aggression not for the sake of destruction, but for the sake of exhibiting their skill. I shall come back to this later next time when I discuss the problem of narcissism or the phenomenon of narcissism. And I just want to say now that in this playful aggression where a man, and in known history they're usually men who like this kind of thing, try to impress themselves, their fellow men, and maybe especially the women, of how wonderful they are by showing their skill in violence. But not because they want to kill, but because they want to show how, in our world we would say how clever they are, in a more primitive world one would simply say how strong they are. Then I spoke about what I call reactive aggression, an aggression which is in the service of life in order to defend one's life, one's freedom, and that of one's fellow man or one's family. But I also emphasized how often, especially when it's a matter of war, people are brainwashed to think that they are defending their lives, and if that happens on both sides, then indeed it becomes right. Because if two nations can be persuaded that each other is threatening one, then indeed each nation is willing to go to war and willing to destroy the other. And what would not have been necessary before, or what was not true before, becomes true by this act of persuasion. And eventually I spoke last time about the compensatory aggression, that is to say, where a person becomes furious, wants to use violence when he feels that he is impotent. And by impotent, I said I did not mean sexually impotent primarily so, but impotent to express, to change the world, to touch the world, to make another person do what he wants, to make the world yield to him in some way or another, when he feels that he cannot do this by his powers of reason, of love, of patience, of example, then indeed he wants to use force to attain that which he cannot attain by those powers which are specifically human. And anyone who has a pistol, who has power, who has economic or political power, can use force, even if otherwise he's completely impotent. Now today I want to speak about that kind of aggression which leads us into true pathology, the aggression which I call here necrophilous aggression. Let me first, and this is an aggression which, in contrast to the aggressions I discussed so far, is not anymore in the service of life, not even anymore a compensation for the inability to live, but which is in the service of death, in which death and destruction in themselves are wanted, are desired, are attractive, in spite of the fact that the person is still alive. Now, the word necrophilia or necrophilous, which I use here, is a word known to some of you, especially psychiatrists or those who have read Krafft-Ebing or any other description of perversions. What one meant by necrophilia was a perversion precisely where a man had the desire to have sexual intercourse with a dead woman. Now that is indeed very rare, but it happens in reality, and it happens more frequently so in dreams. Necrophilia in this sense literally means the love for the dead. Just as there is another perversion which is also rare, but also happens, and also in dreams more frequently than in reality, namely necrophilia, the wish to eat of the dead, to eat a corpse. This is the most, you might say, degraded form of cannibalism there is, degraded now in the sense of the degree of pathology there is. However, I do not use the term necrophilia here in the classic sense of describing the perversion, but I have borrowed the particular use of this term from a great man, from the Spanish philosopher Unamuno, who won in a speech in 1936 used that word in the specific sense in which I'm using it here tonight. And I think it is the best introduction for this use if I read you the speech of Unamuno, and besides that, if you had come here only to hear that little speech, I think it would not have been for nothing. This speech was made in 1936 in the University of Salamanca, the rector of which Unamuno was at the time. It was in Franco territory, and the general of Franco, General Millán, made a speech there. And the favorite motto of the general was, "Viva la muerte," long live death. And when the general had finished, Unamuno rose and said, and now I'm quoting from his speech, "Just now I heard a necrophilous and senseless cry, 'Long live death.' And I, who have spent my life shaping paradoxes which have aroused the uncomprehending anger of others, I must tell you, as an expert authority, that this outlandish paradox is repellent to me." Outlandish, incidentally, is a reference to Nazi and fascist thought. General Millán Astray is a cripple. Let it be said without any slighting undertone. He is a war invalid. So was Cervantes. Unfortunately, there are too many cripples in Spain just now. And soon there will be even more of them if God does not come to our aid. It pains me to think that General Millán Astray should dictate the pattern of mass psychology. A cripple who lacks the spiritual greatness of a Cervantes is wont to seek ominous relief in causing mutilation around him. At this, General Millán was unable to restrain himself. "Abajo la inteligencia," down with intelligence, he shouted. "Long live death." There was a clamor of support for this remark from the Phalangists, but Unamuno went on. "This is a temple of the intellect, and I am its high priest. It is you who profane its sacred precincts. You will win because you have more than enough brute force, but you will not convince. For to convince you need to persuade. And in order to persuade you would need what you lack, reason and right in the struggle. I consider it futile to exhort you to think of Spain. I have done." After this speech, he was arrested. He lived under house arrest for another few months and then died. Now, what Unamuno described here with the word necrophilous was precisely the mood which General Millán expressed, the mood of joy in death, not of the willingness to die for the sake of another man, for the sake of an idea, but a life in which death itself is pleasant, is joyful, and life itself, therefore, is nothing. Now, let me try to give you a very brief description of the personality of the necrophilous person. Mind you, to say this right away, the purely or the primarily or predominantly necrophilous person is relatively rare. It is a malignant sickness. However, whenever they are in power, they can indeed destroy a nation and can destroy the human race. Or they can create great destruction in families, in groups, and so on. What is the necrophilous person like? It's a person who can be recognized most of all by the fact that he is primarily fascinated by all that is dead, by all that is not alive. He is fascinated by dirt, by corpses, by decay, by illness, by destruction, by human or animal feces, by all that is which is on the side of dead and not on the side of life. You will find in these persons that they come to life really when they speak of death, when they speak of decay. That fascinates him. You find sometimes that this person is only interested where he will be buried. He is never interested how he will live. It is a kind of person, and this alone would not make a necrophilous person, but it's one of the little traits, who is most fascinated in death announcements in the newspaper, more than in life announcement, although we haven't so many life announcements these days to read in the newspapers, even since the New York Times is published again. Let me give you an example of an peculiar interest in death, which I take from a book which is not yet published in English, but which will soon be published here, the posthumously published autobiography of Jung, of Carl Jung. Now, I don't mean to say that he was a necrophilous person, but I want, nevertheless, to give an illustration of some necrophilous traits and what it means, because this book is accessible to you once it appears and you can read it. When he was building his house in Bollingen, he found the corpse, or I guess the skeleton, of a soldier who apparently, according to all reasoning, had died 150 years earlier in the Napoleonic Wars. Well, I think it's kind of difficult to know what one does if one finds a skeleton in one's garden, but he buried it, or him, if you please. Well, I think that is a very sensible and human act. But then he did something more. He fired 3 rifle shots over the grave as a salute, as a military salute to the dead soldier. That is very peculiar, because over 150 years had gone by, he was not a soldier. Why this peculiar ceremony around the dead body? And then he took a photo and hung the photo in his studio. Now, all this, you might say, is all very harmless. There's nothing wrong about it. And yet, if one looks at the unconscious, at that which is not conscious in a man, and if one is concerned, as I am right now, with necrophilous traits, then all this is not just a perfectly simple thing. It shows a certain fascination with death, with corpses. Let me tell you of a dream of a person whom I happen to know, who was certainly very necrophilous. That's the following dream. It's actually, well, you will see. It's a dream in which he dreamt that he saw a coffin with a corpse inside. And on top of the coffin, lunch was served. And then he was brought a book. This man was an intellectual. In fact, he still is, I hope. And then he was brought a book in which all great names of the world was written down, starting with Moses or Socrates, and he was asked to sign his name at the end of the list. Now, what this dream expresses, although in a slightly veiled form, is necrophilia. It is only slightly veiled that he eats a corpse. In the dream, it is veiled that the lunch is served above the coffin. But eating the corpse here means really that he eats all those who are dead, all the great men, and by having filled himself with them, he becomes a great man. Here you have a peculiar trait of being attracted by the dead, incorporating the dead, and therefore, by being nourished by the dead, becoming great and powerful himself. You might say that on the whole, the necrophilic person is deeply in love with force. That is to say, to speak more simply, with a power to kill. In fact, what you find very often is that he really only knows two sexes, which are not the sexes which you are usually talking about, namely men and women. He knows two other sexes, those who kill and those who are killed. And those who kill, he loves and admires. And those who are killed, he has contempt for and despises. Very often you find in dreams of such person that they are in love with a person who otherwise doesn't attract them at all, but who has a capacity to kill. In fact, very often with people whom consciously they are afraid of and hate. And yet deep down they feel a very profound attraction for this person, because the person is a killer. Because this is what impresses you and excites their love. You might say in another language, this is really the essence of deep sadism. And I would define here sadism in the sense in which Simone Weil has defined it, namely in the sense of using force. And what is using force? Using force means that I transform a living being into a corpse. And that means I transform a living being into a thing. The necrophilous sadistic person is driven not to bring things to life, but to bring life, to transform life into things. And by force, by using force, you do indeed transform life, that which is alive, into a thing. Actually, you might say, using force means, and that is a strong trait in the necrophilous person, to transform the organic into the inorganic, to transform that which is alive into that which is only mechanical. You will find, for instance, that the necrophilous person very often is most fascinated by machines, by a car. In fact, if I may remind you of a cartoon which was in New Yorker some time ago, where the sales girl in a store recommends a perfume to a woman and says, you know, it just smells like fresh leather in a sports car. And indeed, one has the impression that these days, many men find themselves more attracted by sports cars than by women. Now, there is a love for the mechanical, for that which you can make race, for that where you push the buttons, and you have the sense of power, but of power which you have not by your influence on that which is alive, but by the mechanical influence on that which is not alive. You find very often that the necrophilous person is a person who is mainly interested in the past rather than in the present. For instance, he very often is very sentimental, like many sadists are. He can think with great sentiments of emotional experiences which he believes he had in the past, and then he cries. But he is very little able to have an emotional experience in the present, because in the present, to the present life he is cold. But he gives himself the semblance of an emotional experience by the memory, by having the memory of that which he thought, which he thinks once was alive. That, I think, is the essence of sentimentality. He can cry in a movie, but he can never cry when it is real life, because all that which is real to him, inasmuch as it is life, is feared. You might also say, in the extreme case, a necrophilous person relates himself to life only by possessing it. Whether that is a flower, a woman, a man, a child, he has to possess it, then he can relate himself to it. But he cannot relate himself to the flower which he cannot pluck. This topic, incidentally, as a footnote, has been treated by Dr. Suzuki in a book, Zen Buddhism and Psychoanalysis, of which I wrote also a part, but the more important part is really the discussion of Dr. Suzuki on Zen Buddhism. And in the beginning of this lecture, which is published there, he makes it very clear what is the difference between the attitude of enjoying the flower while it is alive and the need to pluck it in order to enjoy it. Now, mind you, I'm not saying that anybody who wants to pluck the flower for that reason is a necrophilous person. That would be a disastrous effect of this lecture, if you would believe me. I'm only trying to define or to describe what is meant by necrophilus here by mentioning various attitudes, each one of which is not necessarily, doesn't constitute necrophilia, but the totality of which might point to this phenomenon which I'm trying to describe. Another trait, again, which is characteristic for the necrophilic attitude is the necrophilous person loves more than everything law and order. He's afraid of life. He wants to control. You see, life, whatever one may say about it, is uncontrollable and uncertain. The only certain thing in life is death. Nothing else is certain, even with all modern statistical predictions. Whether that is a plant, or whether that is a child, or whether that is a man or a woman. As long as where there is life, there is no certainty and there is no control. But if one is afraid of life because one is impotent to live, then one wants to cut down life and to control it. And that means one has to kill it. And there are many ways of killing life other than plain murder. The necrophilous attitude, as I mentioned before, the necrophilous orientation appears very often and much more easily observed in dreams than in real life, than in the conscious life. In dreams you find various symbols which represent this orientation. For instance, caves, the bottom of the ocean, corpses, blindness. I might remind you of Ibsen's Peer Gynt and the story of the trolls. The trolls are necrophilous persons. They are blind and live in caves. They are not geared to life, but they are geared to death. And while blindness in mythology very often, like in Greek mythology, is symbolizing the greatest wisdom, that is to say, the seer, the man who really sees, is blind, because he is blind to the physical world, but he is seeing in the mental world. Another meaning, however, of the symbol of blindness is exactly that of necrophilia, of refusing to see the light, of refusing to see or to feel life. Let me mention you a dream which is published in the book by Dr. Boss, Meta Boss on Dreams, which deals with the following, which has the following content. This is a woman, a married woman, with 2 children, and she has the following dream. They are all sitting and around the dining table and eat. And they are all preoccupied. They eat steak. And the whole concentration in this dream is the beauty of this steak. She sees it very clearly in colors. She sees the juice. She tastes almost the juice in the dream. And everybody on the table is concentrated on on the steak, on his piece of steak, but they don't talk to each other. There's no communication. Each one is completely concentrated on eating the steak. There's only one remark which is made, and that's that of her husband, who says, "You know, on our wedding day, when we got married, we had the same dinner. We ate steak too." Then she sees that there is a rainbow between herself and the rest of the family. And at the end of the rainbow, there is a golden urn. At this point, she thinks, how we are so happy, we love each other so much, but how long can that last? It cannot last. And then she thinks of something which she thinks very often in her conscious life, namely, she is afraid the Russians will invade Switzerland. Now, that is a peculiar idea, because that was in 1951. And one can suspect the Russians of many things, but that they wanted to invade Switzerland is, I think, one of the less reasonable ideas to have. But she was obsessed by this idea that the Russians will invade Switzerland, and in the dream she begins the preparation of the military defense of her house against the Russians. I think she distributes rifles and so on. And then she thinks, no, I shouldn't give in to these thoughts, and there the dream ends. Now, what do you see here? Consciously, this woman believes that she is exceedingly happy, that everybody loves each other, and so on and so on. But what do we see in the dream? We see in the dream, in the first scene, an almost complete lack of communication, and only the act of eating is significant, is experienced as joyful. The only thing that is remembered from the wedding day is the food and nothing else. Then she dreams that between herself and the family there is only one tie, one connection, and that is the rainbow. The rainbow is a connection, but it is not real. It's a fiction. It's an optical illusion of our eyes that this is a connection between 2 points of the earth, or between heaven and earth. And then she sees the urn, the golden urn. Now, what is an urn? Of course, the urn is, for one thing, a container of treasure. And there is the legend which you all know, that at the end of the rainbow you find a treasure. So the urn represents property, and it is a golden urn, so the urn itself is very valuable, even there was no treasure contained in it. But the urn also symbolizes, is a container for ashes. The urn also stands for death. And indeed, property and death, psychologically, and to quote Freud here, also feces, stand for the same thing, for that which is amassed but which is not alive. So what we see here is that after this orgy of eating, in which there is complete separation between the various people, there comes the next step, namely the hope for that, or the love for that which is a treasure or which is death. And then comes the fear of death, or rather the fear people will come who take away her property. That's what the Russians stand for, I gather, in her mind. And here she begins to develop in the dream her own aggression. Because she feels threatened, she can now proceed with preparing a military defense and distribute rifles or whatever it is. So instead of what you see consciously, an idyllic picture of her life, of her relationship to her family, you see underneath a very different picture, namely an almost exclusive attraction or affinity to food and then to death, to that which is death, and then a reaction of her own, namely that of fear and of a wish to kill. Well, those of you who have not been in analysis, and I guess there are only very few among you who haven't, might find that peculiar, to put so much weight on little elements in a dream, but really it's true. This is how things are, by which I don't mean you should be analyzed, but you might watch your own dreams, or you might read the one or the other book about it. And then you will really find that what in a dream seems, what to the unexperienced eye, if you put it that way, seems like something trifling, like a little detail, actually has great meaning and expresses in a very profound sense experiences which the person has. I want to mention one more trait which you find in the necrophilous person quite clearly, and that is he has an expression in his face as if he was constantly smelling a bad odor. It is, I don't know whether I can imitate it, but you know, this kind of facial expression. And it's almost continuous. It's almost like a little tick, although the person is usually not aware of. Perhaps I could give you here, as an example, one of the most outstanding examples of a rather thoroughly necrophilous person, and that was Hitler. I do not know whether you remember from pictures the face of Hitler with exactly this little trait of which is like smelling a bad odor. It's particularly clear, was particularly clear in a movie picture. I do not know how many of you have seen the picture of Hitler after signing the armistice with the French in Compiègne. There he showed himself for what he really was, a cannibal and a necrophilous person. Incidentally, this dream which I quoted before shows also this combination. He made a little dance, and he had the ugliest smile any human being can have, the smile of a cannibal who had just eaten up something alive. But you also find this little expression in his face, this smelling bad odor expression. Now, actually, Hitler, of course, is in many other ways a good example for the completely necrophilous person. There's a story which I believe is authentic for a number of reasons, that in the First World War he was found in a trance-like state, gazing at the corpse of a soldier, of a decayed corpse of a soldier. And one had to take him away by force in order to get him out from this trance, gazing at this decayed corpse. And you see, if you think of Hitler's end, then you would say, if a man had wanted to destroy as many people as he could, including the people, the Germans, whom he pretended to want to help and to save, including himself and including 6 little children of Mr. Goebbels, who were also murdered at that day in the Reichskanzlei in Berlin. If his aim had been as total a destruction as possible, then he would have done precisely what Hitler did. Consciously, he was not aware of this. If he had been aware of it, probably he would have been insane. And certainly, if he had started a program in which he promised to destroy as many Germans as he could, he would not have been the leading political figure in Germany. Consciously, he wanted to save, and unconsciously, he wanted to destroy. And only the end brought out this deep mood of affinity with death and destruction. At the end, he said the Germans deserved it, and he gave the orders to destroy everything in Germany. This macabre mood was one of necrophilia in all its aspects. And one might even speculate whether Hitler might not have committed the many errors which led to his downfall if he had not been so deeply committed to death and more committed to life. Now, we live today in a culture which is machine-minded, which is enamored with gadgets rather than with life, in which, as I said before, the sports car is one of the most attractive things in life. We live in a world which is highly bureaucratized, by which I mean men are treated like things and administered like things, although very nicely. And this is a result of an inhuman industrialization which rules in the Western world regardless of the political concept under which it rules. Even if you take little details of our language, you see the same tendency, slightly necrophilous tendency. What sense does it make that somebody said, "I'm thrilled to death"? It would make some sense to say, "I'm scared to death," because indeed one can die of fright. But how can one be thrilled to death? Or what does it mean if somebody says, "I died to go to the concert," or "I'm dying to go to the concert"? These things are not as language in general is not accidental. They express a mood which is already turning to death rather than to life, to the mechanical rather than to the organic. If you take a phenomenon like Eichmann, you see here not so much the sadist, that's not his aspect, but the complete bureaucrat. It would not have made any difference for him whether he was transporting coal to make life of man more comfortable, or whether he was transporting Jews to kill these people. What he was concerned was, and that became very clear in the trial, was the proper functioning of the organization. And life meant nothing, because he didn't feel any difference between men and coal, life and death, life and things. And if you see his face, incidentally, you see also a cadaverous, necrophilous face of the dried-out bureaucrat. But I want to say one thing, and not just poetically. There is some of Eichmann in all of us already. Eichmann is not over there, and we are the pure ones. As soon as we begin to think in terms of 50 or 100 million people being killed on either side or on both sides in case of an atomic war, as soon as we discuss a balance sheet as it is done today, of 70 million being acceptable and maybe 120 million not acceptable, what else are we but Eichmanns? What else are we that we have lost the sense of life and deal with living beings in terms of a balance sheet of numbers? I want to read you a document, not the whole document, but part of it, which for the first time really in this way expresses this particular combination of mechanization, love for things and gadgets, and the affinity to death. And that is in the initial manifesto of Futurism, the art direction in art, written by Marinetti and published in 1909. That's pretty early. That is long before men in the West were so enamored by gadgets. We shall sing the love of danger, the habit of energy and boldness. Literature has hitherfore glorified thoughtfully mobility, ecstasy, and sleep. We shall extol aggressive movement, feverish insomnia, the double quick step, the somersault, the box on the ear. We declare that the world's splendor has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. A racing motor car is its frame adorned with great pipes, like snakes with explosive breath. A roaring motor car which looks as though running on shrapnel is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace. We shall sing of the man at the steering wheel, whose ideal stem transfixes the earth, rushing over the circuit of her orbit. We wish to glorify war, the only health giver of the world, militarism, patriotism, the destructive arm of the anarchists, the beautiful ideas that kill, the contempt for women. We wish to destroy the museums, the libraries, to fight against moralism, feminism, and all opportunistic utilitarian meanness. It is in Italy that we launched this manifesto of violence, destructive and incendiary, by which we this day found Futurism, because we would deliver Italy from its cancer of professors, archaeologists, cicerones, and antiquaries. Well, here you see the song of death combined with the song of the love for the racing car. And I think to some of you the analogy will occur between Walt Whitman's Song of Life and the Song of Death of Marinetti. Only a relatively short time later, Walt Whitman's poems are perhaps among the highest points, among the peaks of the development of humanism, from the Renaissance through Goethe to Whitman. And here you find the perversion, the beginning of the decay, the song of love for death, destruction, violence, and for the gadget. Now, you might say, in contrast to necrophilia, the love of death, you could use another word, and that is the word biophilia, the love of life, the love of all of that which is alive, which actually is the normal quality of a human being. You might say it is the person, biophilia can be described as a love for all that unifies and integrates. One of the most fundamental natural forms of integration, unification is sexual union, although sexual union does not necessarily mean unification in any deeper emotional sense, but it might mean that. It is as far nature can go in unifying two peoples, not necessarily as far the spirit can go in unifying it. The person who loves life is recognizable by the fact that he's attracted by the process of life in all its form, whether it's a growing flower, a growing child, a growing idea. He prefers to construct rather than to retain. He prefers the adventure of finding something new to the security of having the old confirmed. He sees the whole rather than only parts. He sees structures rather than summations. He is the non-mechanical person, which does not mean he could not use mechanical things, but it does mean what excites him, what he loves, is to watch that which grows, and that means all that is alive. And that which does not grow is a means rather than an end of life. You might also speak of biophilic ethics, and you might say, from the standpoint of biophilic ethics, and the ethics of Buddhism and of Judaism and of Christianity are biophilic ethics. Good is all that serves the growth of life. Evil is all that strangles life. This has been expressed in our generation very beautifully by Albert Schweitzer, by his concept of reverence for life. And sin is all that strangles life. This is expressed very beautiful in the 5th book of Moses, chapter 28, verse 47, whereas the greatest sin of the Hebrews, or where the greatest sin of the Hebrews is defined in these words, "You will be punished," and now I quote, "because thou didst not serve thy Lord with joy and gladness of heart in the abundance of all things." That is to say, while all things were abundant, you were without joy. That is the biblical concept of sin, which is very similar to the concept which you find in Spinoza, or to the spirit of Spinoza. I want here to quote one sentence of Spinoza from Ethics, 4th book of Ethics, where he says, "A free man thinks of death least of all things, and his wisdom is a meditation not of death, but of life." Well, this is the philosophical expression of the life-loving person's principle, that to be concerned with death means to be attracted by death. And the free man, by which Spinoza means the man who is fully alive, is not concerned with death, but he is concerned with life. Now, pure necrophilia is rare. You will rarely find a person who is purely necrophilic, and if you find him, he is purely insane. And pure biophilia is also rare, and if you find him, he is probably a saint. That is to say, a person in which there is nothing but attraction to life. You find some such persons. Schweitzer himself might be called a purely biophilic person, a person attracted tremendously to life. And you can see that. There's a man who writes profound books on theology and history of the church, who becomes a doctor, who is one of the greatest experts on Bach music and on the organ. There's a man of a richness of life that one wonders how one body can contain all this richness, all this growth. There is abundance, which is always characteristic for the life-loving person, as against the scarcity, which is characteristic for the person who is less capable of loving life. But most of us are mixtures between necrophilic and biophilic tendencies. The question is only, like in all living things, what is a particular kind of mixture? Are we predominantly necrophilic or predominantly biophilic? And I think most people are predominantly biophilic. But our culture, as it develops, with all its mechanization, all its emphasis on that which is inorganic and not alive, lends itself, unfortunately, to a lessening strength of the love of life. Of course, most people are not aware of their necrophilous tendency. I mentioned that already with Hitler, in connection with Hitler. He was probably consciously thinking that he wanted to construct life, to save life. In fact, you see even in him the conflict, because he was interested in architecture, although it was not very good architecture. But nevertheless, he was interested in it, in something constructive. Even this man, who was so deeply attracted by death, had something human in him, where something wanted to construct. But, as the Bible says of Pharaoh, his heart hardened. And the more destructive the things he did, the less capable was he to listen to that small voice of life, which was still in him when he was a young man trying to be a painter or an architect. Most of us are not aware of necrophilia, and this is precisely the reason why I'm talking about it. Because I believe that we should become aware of our own necrophilic tendencies, just as we should become aware of an illness. But what is perhaps more important, we should become aware of the necrophilous persons who try to persuade us that death is sweet, that destruction under one form or another is good. And we should be very aware of them, as we should be aware of an infectious person who can transmit a deadly sickness. Now, I should like to speak here now about the connection between this concept of necrophilia, which I try to present here, with a very important concept Freud developed, which is more or less known to many people, and that is Freud's concept of the death instinct and the life instinct. Eros, the life instinct, and the death instinct, which not by Freud but by other psychoanalysts was called thanatos. Freud came to this theory not originally. Originally, Freud was completely on the side of life, and both the ego instincts and sexual instincts served life. But probably under the impression of an event, the significance, the deadly significance for the spirit of man is still not sufficiently recognized, namely the First World War, with its senseless and brutal slaughter, for nothing. Under the impact of this event, something in Freud changed. I would almost say something in Freud broke. And Freud turned from considering only life as he had done before to considering death as an equally powerful and strong force. And so he assumed that there are two biological forces which operate in all living substance. The force which tended to separate and disintegrate that on which it operates, that is the death instinct. And the force which tends to unify, to integrate, unite an organism within itself, the cells within an organism or various organisms together, that he called the life instinct or eros, very properly in the Platonic sense. And he believed that each individual was a battlefield of these two instincts, that he was ridden by his life was a battlefield of the fight between the tendency to live and the tendency to destroy. And that, furthermore, this tendency to destroy could either be turned outside, and then we have a very hostile and aggressive person, or it could be turned inside, and then you have a person who tends to get sick, to destroy himself rather than others. The theoretical premise of this whole theory was a very interesting speculation, namely that which Freud developed in a paper published in 1920, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he assumed the existence of a mechanism which he called repetition compulsion. By that, he referred to a mechanism that in all living substance exists the tendency to return to the previous stage and eventually to the starting point of this organism. Now, the starting point of all life is inorganic. That's where we come from in a mysterious way. So Freud assumed that if this repetition compulsion was the directing principle of all living beings, then we must assume that in all life there must be the tendency to return to that which is not alive, to the inorganic. In other words, that all life would have the tendency on the one hand to live and on the other hand to die. Freud presented this theory never with the certainty with which he presented many of his other theories, and quite wisely so. Because on the one hand, this whole premise of the repetition compulsion was essentially a theoretical speculation with very little evidence. Freud tried to give all the evidence he could find. It's still a thin evidence. And at the same time, there is so much evidence of the tendency of all that is alive to continue living, that it is hard to believe in the realm of animals or plants or men that there is an equally strong tendency to return to death as there is to continue life. It's a fact, of course, that we all die. It's a fact, of course, that the wise man who has reached a certain fulfillment in life is willing to die and does not fight it. But to be willing to die, as the Old Testament expresses it, satisfied with life, that is something quite different from a tendency which runs through the whole life, which wants to die, and not only to die, to disintegrate, which is attracted to the not living. Nevertheless, this speculation of Freud on the death instinct and life instinct is probably, at least in my opinion, one of the most profound psychological speculations he undertook. Because while in his early theory he had only seen the power and strength of sex, that is to say, of life in all its forms, of the self-preservative instincts, he touched in this new theory on a fact which the First World War made so brutally clear, namely that there is also tremendous destructiveness in man. The question is only, Is this destructiveness part of normal biology, part of life and nature, or is this destructiveness a pathological phenomenon, a perversion, an illness? The main difference between the view which I try to present here and the Freudian view of the life instinct and the death instinct lies in the fact that I believe that this affinity to death, which in its essence is not different from Freud's concept of the death instinct, is not a normal biological part of life, but is the severest pathology which can happen to life, is the only true perversion, namely longing for death while one is alive. And if one looks at it this way, then of course one wonders what are the conditions, and one also wonders then that this affinity to death may not be necessary, which it is really in Freud's concept. That it may not be necessary because it is an illness rather than a normal part of the life process. Well, at this point it's time to stop. I shall, in the next lecture, begin to finish for another 5 or 10 minutes this thought of the difference between the two concepts, and also say a little bit about, not too much because I don't know too much about it, about the conditions for the development of this necrophilous orientation. But the essential part of the lecture will be developed to another phenomenon, namely to narcissism as a pathological phenomenon not only among individuals but among nations. Narcissism is that phenomenon which is considered normal when it refers to the nation or the race, when the same phenomenon, when it is to be found in individual, is considered plainly mad, plain insanity. And I shall talk about the role which this narcissism plays today as one of the elements which create the tendency for violence. We'll have now 10 minutes intermission, and then we'll have about 20 minutes or so to answer questions. Thank you. I had a very pleasant time to read so many interesting and thoughtful questions. Unfortunately, I couldn't even finish reading them all, and much less so can I answer them all, so I'll just begin with what I have at hand here. The one question says, would you say the Christian emphasis on the death of Jesus is necrophilic? Well, this is the time of Easter, and this is the time of life. The Christian idea emphasizes not the death, but the resurrection. If Christ had only died, then indeed the worship of a dead God might be the worship of death. But the worship of a resurrected God is a worship of life. This, incidentally, is an answer to a number of other questions which I had about symbolism in myth and so on. Maybe I come to the one or the other questions, I don't know exactly how far I shall get, but there would be a similar answer. Death in itself is a fact, But the question is, what is the emphasis? What is the aim? What is the goal? Life or death? And in the Christian version of life, of death and resurrection of Christ, certainly, the resurrection is on life, just as in the Hebrew version of Eastern, the emphasis is on liberation from slavery. Freedom and life are the meaning, respectively, of the Hebrew and the Christian concept of Eastern. This question is the idea of reincarnation as a fascination with life or death? Well, the answer would be the same. I think it's a fascination with life. I think it was the humanist Ficino who said, not entirely sure, but I think so, who said that the idea of life after death is a necessary idea, because since most people do not reach salvation in life, how could one tolerate the utter lack of solidarity of the human race if only some reached salvation and the majority wouldn't? Hence, it is necessary to believe in a life after death, because otherwise the unity of the human race would be denied. Now you can see in this particular version of Ficino's humanistic thought about life after death that what he was concerned with life, was with the solidarity of all that is human. And that's why he had, in his way of thinking, to postulate the idea of life after death. And what holds true of that would hold true of reincarnation also. Although as soon as we come to Indian thought, then of course we are confronted with a more subtle and complicated problem, namely the problem of life as a burden, inasmuch as life is greed and thirst. Inasmuch as man can give up his greed and be fully alive, then indeed he does not hang on to anything, and hence he is free from suffering. Buddhist thinking was not a thinking about death, but it was in many ways similar to Spinoza thinking, a thinking about freedom and about the liberation of man from the chains of greed. But it is there a more complicated problem than it is in Western thought. Here is a question which says, has not A.S. Neal proven in his 42 years in Summerhill that the 2,000 years of myth and symbols has produced a negative response to life? Well, this question is a little involved about what he has proven about the 2,000 years of myth and symbols. But I would say, if I could mention a person who is, at least as far as I can see him, biophilic and with no necrophilia, then it is A.S. Neal in his efforts in Summerhill, because he's a man who does not try to cut down life, who has an endless patience and an endless wish to see life growing, even if it is difficult, even if it requires to be in many ways as an outcast from all camps and all thoughts in the Western world. This man, I think, shows what a person can do who is full of love of life. Here's a question which says, would you say the people working for peace in dealing with possibilities of death through war are necrophilic or have strong necrophilic tendencies? Well, that is a perfectly good idea, and I think you find quite a few people, just as you sometimes find among vegetarians, people who repress strongly their deep wish for a good steak, and by repressing it turn vegetarian. But not all vegetarians love steak, and not all pacifists and people who work for war are unconsciously necrophilics. I think, on the contrary, I would think that, and I shall talk about that next time, that really the whole movement against war in our generation or after the First World War was a movement essentially driven by the forces who love life. But certainly, exceptionally, you will find a person who becomes fascinated with the fight against war because he has a necrophilic fascination with death. But they are, I'm afraid, more on the side of those who praise war rather than who want to prevent it. In fact, it would be a very interesting study, which can be made empirically, to see what elements of necrophilia, or how elements of necrophilia in personalities are related to their political attitude towards war. My guess would be that you find a definite correlation between those with strong necrophilic tendencies and those most aggressive in their emphasis that we have to use force, and that is the only way to save our freedom. In some people, you can even see it in the glitter in their eyes when they talk about it, but I shall not mention names. Can you go into what is in the early experience of an individual that predispose him to necrophilia? Well, that is indeed a very difficult question to answer. I shall, in the beginning of my next lecture, come to this question. What are the conditions of necrophilia? Although, if you expect that I shall give an answer, you, I'm afraid, will be disappointed. Did necrophilia, is the next question, on the part of the European Jews have anything to do with their meekly submitting to their destruction by the Nazis? Well, I cannot agree with the facts as they are described here, that they were meekly submitting. What is in my own mind is, in a way, that they were submitting to destruction in a dignified way. Now, it is I know most people today, especially in the state of Israel, feel strongly that the Jews meekly submitted. What is there to do if you know that nothing you do will have any result except that instead of being cast, you will be trampled to death, when you know that there's absolutely nothing which can save you? If one calls that meekly, I personally feel one judges very harshly. And if one calls it meekly, one seems to think that it is more human to die after having killed a few enemies than rather to die with clean hands, on which there is no blood. Certainly, I do not believe that the Jews who were slaughtered, for the reason that they were slaughtered without killing, or without trying to kill, for that reason had necrophilous tendencies. The next question is, could you elaborate somewhat more on the attitude of necrophilia in the political life in our present culture? Well, indeed, I could speak for hours about that, but I shall speak for a few minutes about that at the beginning of the next lecture. The next question is there a jealousy among necrophilous persons for those who love life, and does this generate more hatred and aggression? I think this remark is very much to the point, and I should have mentioned this in my lecture, and I'm glad the question is asked. Indeed, the necrophilous person has an almost bottomless envy of the person who loves life, and that is another reason why he wants to kill him. He cannot stand the existence of a person who loves life, because this very existence of a life-loving person shows him in his own pathology. And that's why there is nobody more hated by the necrophilic than the person who loves life. There's a next question which says, you say that if Hitler had been aware he would have been insane. Was he not insane then? Well, there are all degrees of insanity. In Hitler's case, I should have better have said, or I could have said perhaps, if he had been insane, he would have permitted himself to be aware of it. That's another way of putting it. But actually, what you find in Hitler, like sometimes, is really that as soon as the greatest madness is shared by millions of people, it appears to one's own consciousness as reason, as moral value. What most of us think is rational is essentially based on the fact that we consider that rational which is agreed on by the majority of people. And what most of us think is good is essentially that which is agreed on by the majority of people as being good. The case of authentic judgment of what is rational, what is good, which is not influenced by majority, which is not the result of brainwashing, if one goes a little further, is relatively rare. And there is another thing. One can indeed get one's idea of what is rational, what is good, from the consensus of humanity, from the consensus perhaps of the greatest thinkers of humanity, rather than from the utterly accidental element of who has power in a given situation. There is another question. Are the ones who are for capital punishment necrophilic minded? And what are your views on capital punishment? Well, I think capital punishment is in some ways a good indicator, but many people, and perhaps most people, don't think seriously about the question of capital punishment or not. Most people are persuaded by arguments which are as shallow as the arguments that atomic armament can save freedom, so they are persuaded that capital punishment is a deterrent to murder. It's just as little a deterrent. In this case, it has been proven. I'm afraid, in the other case, it might be proven to be untrue in a more horrible way. So if you take the average person and who agrees with capital punishment, that does not necessarily mean that this is a necrophilous trait. But if you take the person who gets very excited and very violent when you argue with him and say you are against capital punishment, then you see for him the idea that a man should be killed also, although ritualistically, in the ritualistic form of law, that for him this has a great attraction. And think of the people who love to witness an execution. This today is not done anymore, but it wasn't so long ago that they were the ones that there were hundreds who witnessed the execution with pleasure, that it was the most joyful thing they could witness. And don't feel that this is after all a long time ago, because what else is it which makes our newspaper, except New York Times and some other newspapers, not publish reports of crimes? What else is it but the fact that people love to read murder? What else is it when people are fascinated by seeing an accident, when this is the most exciting event in their life? Neither the pictures, the paint of the Metropolitan Museum, nor Beethoven's or Mozart's music on the radio, nor all the beautiful books which they can read are as exciting for some as to see a corpse, as to see the accident of two automobiles. This is indeed a symptom of necrophilia. Well, I think it is, I have about another 50, 60 questions here, and I cannot even try to begin, so I think we respect the time and end here and meet next week. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.